Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on childcare and the workforce. We're going to go ahead and get started and kick off today's webinar. So I'd like to, before we begin, just go over a few housekeeping items. First, my name is Amy Shields. I'm the Director of Community Advancement here at ACCE, and I'll be moderating the webinar here today. So I just wanted to let everyone know that you are all in listen-only mode. If you do have questions during the webinar, please go ahead and type those questions into the chat. The chat box is on the lower right-hand side of your screen, and we will work to get as many of those questions answered as possible throughout the course of our webinar here today. We are also recording this webinar, and we will be uploading it to ACCE's website, and we'll follow up with you with an email for the webinar as well. In addition to a recording of this webinar, when we follow up, we'll also be sending you a new one-pager that we have developed on the importance of focusing on early child care, and particularly care for those ages 0 to 3. So we've just developed a new resource on that we will send out to the group. You can also find that resource and a copy of the slides that are being presented today in the handouts section of GoToWebinar. So before we begin, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. Rob Grunewald is an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He conducts research on community development and regional economic issues. He co-authored Early Childhood Development, Economic Development with a High Public Return in 2003 and has written several subsequent articles on the economic and social impact of early learning. He frequently speaks to community and business leaders, policymakers, and media throughout the United States. Rob has served on boards and advisory committees for organizations involved with early childhood development, including Think Small, Leaders in Early Learning, First Children's Finance, and the Minnesota Visiting Nurse Agency. He's also a past president of the Minnesota Economic Association, and we're so glad to have Rob here with us today. Our second speaker this afternoon is Katy Brooks. She's the Bend Chamber of Commerce CEO. Her vision for the chamber is to catalyze an environment where businesses, their employees, and the community thrive. The chamber supports a collaborative business environment and leads efforts to resolve on tough issues like the childcare and housing shortage, helping lead a developing innovation district, and advocating for business at the local and state level. Katy's background is in government relations and enables her to understand public policies and issues in order to advocate for the businesses of Bend. Her experience in economic development and public affairs lends itself to forming partnerships and alliances that support a growing business community. Katy is a member of the Oregon State Early Learning Council, the Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council, and has served on the City of Bend advisory committees. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Rob, who is going to kick off our presentation for today.
Okay, here I am. Thank you, Amy, and it's great to be able to talk with all of you and look forward to your questions about childcare. I'm going to talk a bit about the role that the Federal Reserve has played in early care and education for the past few years, and then get into the impact of the pandemic on the childcare sector. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is a standard disclaimer. These are my own views and not those of the Federal Reserve. We'll go to the next slide. And this is a map of the Federal Reserve system. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, and just recognizing where you are located within the Federal Reserve. I'll speak just a little bit about the department that I'm in. The Federal Reserve is of course, responsible for monetary policy, regulating the flow of money and credit in the economy to achieve stable prices and maximum employment. The Federal Reserve is one of the bank regulators in the economy and serves as the bank and provides fiscal services for the federal government. We'll go to the next slide. A smaller function within the Federal Reserve is community development. These departments were formed after the passing of the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977. And these departments help promote the economic resilience and mobility of low to moderate income individuals and communities using research, information sharing, training, and convening. Each of the 12 reserve banks have different focuses. At the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, our focus is on early childhood, housing, and community investment issues. But you can consider community development a resource, and more and more my colleagues at other banks are getting interested in understanding how childcare affects their regional economies. I'm going to go to the next slide and just start with some very high-level comments about how the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis got into this. You can click through just a couple more times until this image populates. Back in 2003, our Director of Research, Art Rolnick, and I wrote a paper called Early Childhood Development, Economic Development with a High Public Return. We used research from two areas. First, brain science, which back then was the Neurons to Neighborhoods book was coming out just a few years before, and even since the writing of our first paper, there's much more that's been learned about early brain science. But very short version is that the first few years are a very sensitive period for development. There's a strong proliferation of connections in the brain, and the environments in which children grow up affect the quality of those connections, including sensory pathways and language during the first year of life and higher cognitive function during the first few years of life. We'll go to the next slide. The second piece of research is looking at 4 key longitudinal studies that ask the question, what is the impact of investing in early childhood for children who come from more disadvantaged situations? And the 4 studies are listed here. They all use cost-benefit analysis, including the Perry Preschool, which is in Michigan, providing preschool for 3 and 4-year-old children. The Abecedarian Educational Childcare Program is a full-day program from a few months old to age 5. The Chicago Child Parent Center program is a preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds, and then different than center-based program, but a home visiting program with nurses was originally studied in Elmira, New York. And the key takeaway from here is that over a long period of time, economists have been able to tabulate benefits and monetary value relative to the cost of the program. They're well over 1. There's a return on investment. And when we look at who benefits the most from these, actually most of these benefits across these programs go to the non-participants, to the taxpayer, in the form of reduced educational spending, less need for social services, lower crime costs, and ultimately higher tax revenue and more private earnings for these individuals when they join the workforce. In the next slide, continued research on the Perry Preschool study shows effects that move all the way to the second generation, that is the children of the children who attended this preschool program many years before. Surveys show that they were able to complete high school without suspension at higher rates and never suspended, addicted, or arrested, and they're more likely to be employed full-time or self-employed. So showing evidence that an investment in young children today can have a long-term benefit, even moving into the second generation. So within the overall area of early care and education, it's a broader way of looking at all of the various programs that are available for young children that provide enrichment and care during the day. And those can include Head Start, which is federally funded for low-income children, or public preschool that's often funded at the state level. It could be in preschool programs or in private preschool programs. And then, of course, what we'll talk more about today, the childcare component, which includes childcare centers and home-based family childcare programs that are licensed, which would be the more formal part of that system. And then there's also informal arrangements that are not regulated. But we'll be looking more at the childcare centers and also the home-based family childcare programs. So go to the next slide. So there's a large, strong participation in the labor force among parents that have young children. So this graphic here is showing that 2/3 of children under the age of 6 have all of their parents in the labor force and are needing some care during the day. And we recognize that a reliable and accessible childcare system allows parents to make that choice to enter the workforce and to be productive at their jobs. And research that's been conducted in a handful of states now and also at the national level based on surveys of parents have been working on articulating what the economic impact of a well-functioning childcare system is. We'll go to the next slide. So this is research that was commissioned by Ready Nation, conducted by Clive Belfield at Columbia. And it's based on a national sample survey and asked parents that have children ages 0 to 2 about their potential childcare problems and the impact that that may have had on their productivity and performance at work. So as you see on this slide, 25% have problems participating in work-related education or training. Going down the list, 13% had your pair hours reduced, or 8% had been let go or fired. So we'll go to the next slide. Also in the survey, we see that 25% had reduced regular work hours, 25% turned down a new job offer, 13% quit a job. So looking at the results of this survey and understanding the impact of the loss of revenue or loss of income for families, and then also the loss of revenue and extra hiring costs to businesses, what the author does is estimates what that annual impact is from this cohort of survey respondents. So we'll go to the next slide. So rolling this all up at a national level, that working parents with this group lose $37 billion. This is the lost earnings and extra cost of job search. Businesses lose $13 billion. It's lost revenues and extra costs to rehire. And taxpayers lose $7 billion, which is a lower income tax and sales tax. So these are comments that all reflect on the childcare sector prior to the pandemic. As we were moving closer to March of last year, I was hearing a lot from chambers of commerce, both at the state and local levels, about the challenges their members were having filling open positions, and many identifying that availability of childcare was a key piece of being able to allow those potential parent employees to join their businesses. And so times have changed, and I'm going to talk a lot about that. But recognizing before the pandemic arrived, the discussion around the availability of childcare was top of mind, both at chambers and also at businesses. So we'll go to the next slide. So what happened with March, especially as we had state economies closing, we're moving more to the shutdown or the lockdown mode. Some states chose to close childcare programs. Some states elected to keep them open. So it was a mixed response among states there. There was increased in unemployment, much more working at home. And one survey response by the Bipartisan Policy Center, was a national survey, showed that 61% of parents reported that their childcare provider had closed due to COVID-19. And looking at all the various types of data that we could get our hands on, we estimate that altogether demand during March and April dropped by about 60 to 75%, different parts of the country. And those providers that did stay open are operating at reduced levels. Just this week, those providers in Minnesota, for example, they have an opportunity to register their business on a state website and also declare how many spots they have available. And at average, the providers that are responding to that are operating at 61% of capacity. We'll go to the next slide. The situation back in March and April brought childcare to high relief, especially recognizing the need for childcare for essential workers, that state officials and recognized that if childcare wasn't available, that they would lose a substantial amount of the healthcare workforce and first responder workforce, also other essential industries such as workers in grocery stores. And the definition of essential worker was varied by states. Some states did declare childcare as an essential industry and was able to provide some extra protection for those workers. Colleagues at the Atlanta Fed estimated that there's 2.6 million of the nation's healthcare workers and first responders are parents to children under 14 years old with no other adult in the household. So these are workers that needed childcare. So states had different strategies for how to encourage providers to stay open. In those states that did not close childcare, and states that did close childcare, they had different ways that providers could apply to provide childcare to those essential workers. So moving forward to the next slide. And the second piece is recognizing that with an increase in employment coming in May and June, that people are going back to work, and that childcare is an important role, it's playing an important role for those parents to do so. Back in the survey conducted by the Bipartisan Policy Center, they found that among parents who sought a formal care arrangement during March and early April, that 63% had difficulty finding childcare. So they were concerned about what the future would hold. And at that time, 47% of parents were concerned they wouldn't be able to find childcare when they returned to the workforce. We'll go to the next slide. So a recent survey that was released by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation first surveyed parents about their current situation, and recognizing that almost half of working parents are now working remotely and have children. Many of them have children staying at home, 3/4. 65% of parents have changed their childcare arrangements, which speaks to the volatility that's happening within that sector, within that market. And that volatility is likely to continue as parents expect their own work situations to change and fluctuate relative to their childcare needs. So 60% of parents expecting they'll need to change their childcare within a year. And we'll go to the next slide. On the business side, those employers that were surveyed, 79% noted that they had shifted a large part of their workforce to remote work. 40% of employers offered additional childcare accommodations. It was primarily through offering flexible schedules to their employees, and that 40% of employers were concerned that some employees will not fully return. And when asked why, health and safety concerns around the pandemic and the virus were the key issue, but childcare was also noted as a concern that employers have about why employees may not be able to make it back to work. So this is from the parent perspective and from the businesses as they are engaging in the childcare sector. But the pandemic has had a notable impact on childcare providers. So we'll go to the next slide. To operate safely during the pandemic, providers have made a number of adjustments to their business models. And speaking here both for child care centers and also the home-based family providers. Following CDC guidance, there's increased sanitization and health checks, which requires more staff time. Providers are responding by either reducing their hours that they're offering for service so that their staff on hand can do the sanitization. But in particular, some providers are eating that cost potentially, and some may need to pay a little more to get that done. There are modified child drop-off and pickup protocols so parents don't enter the child care providers' buildings. And that just also speaks to other types of ways of working with the groups so that groups of children stay together in childcare centers and they don't intermingle. As the pandemic has moved into different parts of the country, there's increased sick leave, need for teacher substitution, which affects these businesses. And if there is an exposure at a business, that provider needs to close for a few days to disinfect. And as you know and imagine, staying 6 feet away from each other is difficult with young children. So working with children the best way you can to keep groups contained, and also using personal protective equipment in a way that is able to keep people as safe as possible, and using that strategically. Let's go to the next slide. But perhaps the largest cost impact of the pandemic is on childcare centers, as they reduce the number of children that are in a single group. So following the recommended practice, you would have group sizes no larger than 10, which would be at most 9 children to 1 adult. And one analysis that I wrote for Minnesota, and but generalizes fairly well to other states, is looking at how ratios and group sizes change when you shift from what was under licensing regulations to a 10-person group limit. So you see on this slide that the ratios and group sizes, first we down at the bottom, you can see the group sizes go below 10 total. So that means 9 or fewer children. And then also we're shifting those ratios relative to those group sizes. So this particularly impacts toddler, preschool, and school-age classrooms because now providers are serving fewer children, but still have to pay for the fixed costs for their program, such as building costs and utilities and their mortgage and lease and so on. So we'll go to the next slide. So for childcare centers, in this example, we have the toddler classrooms cut in half, preschool classrooms by more than half, school-age classrooms by more than a third. And while staff decreases, one survey of all providers by the National Association for the Education of Young Children showed that there was a majority of providers indicated that they had reduced staff. Here in the Twin Cities, a survey of those childcare centers that were still open show almost 60% had reduced staff. But despite reducing staff, there are those fixed costs. So a toddler classroom reduced net revenue by $2,600 per month, and in preschool and school-age classrooms reducing $4,900 in net revenue per month. So smaller home-based family childcare providers have a different business model than a childcare center, and so they're not as affected by the smaller group size limit, except for those that are serving more than 9 children. And in some states, there is a regulation where you can have a family group license, which would allow you to serve more than that 9 children. So those providers that will really vary on states would be affected by this 10-person group limit if they're following that practice. So in response to the difficulty within the childcare sector, the government, both at the federal and state level, have provided support to the sector. We'll go to the next slide. The CARES Act in the spring distributed $3.5 billion to states to use, and there's a lot of variation among state responses. Some states allocated general revenue to the sector, such as providing grants to providers to help cover some of these additional costs. There's also been coordination around supporting providers acquiring sanitization supplies and also PPE. And there's also, anecdotally, we hear of resources where business associations or businesses themselves participate in seeing if their own buying power or their own connections can help support connecting childcare providers to these sanitization supplies and PPE. In terms of going forward, the Senate has passed $15 billion for childcare in the relief package that's currently under discussion. And the need for relief in the sector will depend upon the length of the pandemic. To date, the amount of supply relative to demand does vary by state, but the relief from the CARES Act and those states that have provided some support have been able to at least keep the sector hobbling along. The CARES Act money at the state, much of this, if it was used in this grant format to providers, is going to be running out. And certainly an infusion of $15 billion would help support at least for a few more months at the state level to reach out to providers and to keep covering these COVID-related costs. But if it is a protracted pandemic that goes well into next year, the policymakers will need to be continually reviewing what the need is for the sector, because a big concern would be if there were so many providers that decided that they could not continue to operate under these conditions and decided to close business, and we would lose that important infrastructure support to be able to allow parents to join the workforce. Just as I'll close here just with a couple more data points. One is that a national look at the national workforce, there's about 10% of workers have a child that's under the age of 14 without another adult to help support with childcare. And as we move into an environment where there's a lot of differences in how states or how school districts are planning to operate, especially if many larger school districts are finding it's unsafe to come back together in person or going more virtual, there's going to be, a way that the childcare sector will likely be helping to support those school-age kids who are going to need some place to be, as they are in a more of a distance learning. It is both on the school side and the provider side. There's a lot of working out to decide, determine what that would all look like. And in terms of, for families that have very young children, that's more around 5% of the workforce have a very young child without another adult to support childcare. So without the sector, we continue to just constrain that reopening of the economy and to have workers available to fill open positions. So go to the next slide. I think that might be the final one. Yeah, there are some resources. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Amy.
Great, thank you so much, Rob. We're going to take a pause here for a moment and see if there are any questions here for Rob about the data that he's presented or any other questions that you might have. Remember that you can type into that question box if you do have questions. So I'll give folks a moment here to type in any questions that you might have.
Amy, while we're pausing for a question, maybe I'll make one more comment, if that's okay.
Of course.
The work, prior to the pandemic, we had recognized that there were a number of chambers of commerce, both at the local level, at the state level, that were getting more involved in the childcare issue. Our district spans over to Montana, and one chamber we recognized that we have a case study about on our website is Missoula. And the Missoula chamber there helped field a survey of parents in their community to understand where childcare demand was. And they also brought resources together. They called themselves matchmakers, with resources around those who work in the childcare business, architects, and then real estate, to find ways that they could increase that supply. So they had some success in being able to provide some synergies at that leadership level of the chamber. Also, 41 state chambers and local chambers signed a letter to Congress recently encouraging Congress to include childcare in its relief packages, showing the signs of the concern of business leaders about the childcare sector as we continue to reopen the economy.
Great, thanks. I have a couple questions here about the scope of the number of folks that have children under the age of 18. And so just curious if you know sort of that piece of things, the kind of scope of just the number of folks who have 18 or under at home.
Yeah, so I'll get a little more specific about the data I was just sharing. So looking at employed workers, and while we're maybe during the next presentation, I can look at age 18 and under and provide you some numbers, or after the fact, provide you more numbers about that age group. But just reviewing the data about the labor force, so just looking at employed workers in the U.S. labor force, that there are, for those that have a child under age 14 is 21.4%, and that breaks down to 10.7% between ages of 6 to 13. For ages 0 to 5, it's 6.3%, and for parents that have both, it's a 4.5%. So it's a notable sector, amount of family of workers that are connected to young children. They use age 14 as a cutoff in part because at 14 and over, once you're up to 13, there's some sense that you do need support and guidance during the day. 14 and above, there's some more leniency in terms of being able to be independent during the day.
Great, thank you. And I just want to note that Kimberly Hannon from the Missoula Chamber is actually on the call today, and she has offered that they have a second survey out right now, and they're happy to share both of those surveys with anyone who's interested. So Kimberly, if you'd like to send those surveys along to me, then I'm happy to include them in the follow-up materials from today's session. So thank you for offering to do that. And then the one other question I'll ask you before we move on is, do you have any suggestions of the role that chambers can play in this space? What have you seen that might be a great example of collaboration, or what chambers and businesses are doing to help solve this challenge?
Great. Well, I think that's what we'll hear from our next presentation is some details about that. But I'll share a bit what I've heard and seen on the ground in terms of suggestions. First of all, before and during the pandemic, when a local chamber or state chamber comes to the public and says that childcare is important, the public and policymakers listen in a new way. When I've seen states that have been able to move the childcare agenda forward and take it seriously, the chamber has been there and has been an important voice. And so when business leaders are shining the light on childcare, that by itself makes a big difference. In terms of during the pandemic, there have been these attempts at the local level to understand what business needs are for employees and what their employees' challenges are with childcare, and they get it's possible for a local chamber to be involved. For the example of Missoula, either perhaps helping to field a survey, surveying their own members about what they're seeing on the ground, and connecting to the organizations within states such as Childcare Aware, fill in the state name. So for example, Childcare Aware of Minnesota is ours. At the national level is Childcare Aware of America. But they have resource and referral networks through that Childcare Aware system that works with providers and can be a good connection point. You also might find other childcare intermediaries within your states or your local areas that a chamber can connect with and help define how can we partner together to support that sector. And one example is procuring and distributing some of these cleaning, sanitization supplies and PPE, which are so difficult to get.
Great, thanks, Rob. We are going to transition now. I know there's some other questions, but we're going to go ahead and transition. And I'm going to turn the presentation over to Katy Brooks from the Bend, Oregon Chamber. And I'm just going to see if I can unmute her here. And then we also have one of her staff members. Katy, are you able to hear me, and are you all set?
Yes, I'm all set. Thanks.
Wonderful. So I'm going to turn it over to Katy. And Katy, if you'll just let me know when you want me to advance your slides, we'll go from there.
That sounds great. Well, thank you for asking us to come chat with you a little bit about what we're doing at the local level here at the Bend Chamber. And I have on the webinar with me Megan Norris, who I'm going to be talking about as we go through these slides. She is our Childcare Accelerator position that came out of the process I'm going to go over with you. I was listening earlier about the changes to childcare and all the U.S. Chamber Foundation is doing, and many, many others during COVID. And I want to address that because it has definitely made us stop and pivot. But I thought it would still be really relevant to go through how did we get to this point to begin with on a local level. So go ahead and advance the slide. Hopefully everyone can hear me. This is my phone because something went haywire with my computer today. But the first thing I wanted to share was this is a familiar landscape for all of you, I'm sure. The childcare crisis in Central Oregon is pretty significant. Before COVID even hit, only 1 out of 3 kids had between the ages of 0 and 5 had a place to go as far as childcare was concerned in our area. So we were definitely considered a childcare desert. Now that COVID has started to ravage the numbers here, we're expecting probably around the last poll I saw, the last information was around 48% of the childcare facilities that were in existence before COVID will survive the economic downturn and protocols that have been coming out of the governor's office as we operate during a pandemic. Next slide. So this group got together. It was multiple stakeholders. I have another slide that shows you who was at the table. But what was really essential was trying to find how do you break this apart. And what we did understand is that the private sector and business had a role to play. The impacts on workforce to women in the workforce particularly, but families in the workforce had come to a head. And I, as the CEO of the Bend Chamber, was actually hearing from our membership that they're losing staff in less than 3, I think we were hovering before COVID around 3.4% unemployment. So really tight employment market. And they were losing good talent because they couldn't find enough childcare. When we took this on, we went out, talked with private sector and also got some public sector and nonprofit foundation support and raised about $125,000. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is the steering committee that worked together on fundraising and really defining what is it that we were actually going to do. And so you see it's the chamber, it's folks from our local neighbor impact and childcare facility, family services organizations, etc. And so it was a blend of schools, family services, business, and health agencies, etc., and even the academic world and the city, who came together and said, we each have a little piece of this. Nobody's going to solve it on their own. And what tack can we take that might actually increase the amount of slots available in our region and do it in a scalable fashion on a compressed timeline? We originally set ourselves a goal of 1,000 new by, Megan's going to probably correct me, I think within the first 2 years. So it was pretty aggressive. And we were actually on that path in forming relationships with the 2 academic institutions in our community and a bunch of willing businesses who were looking at kind of a macro center approach where academia would develop the programming. We would form partnerships to identify providers who could implement and physical properties around the region that we identified as having high probability of accommodating childcare, and private sector folks who would either help offset costs in the way of subsidizing their employees, pay for childcare, or somehow finding somebody to donate land, development costs, any other costs that would get the ROI to stabilize and identify ways that we could lower the actual overall cost, not only of startup, but operationally over time. And that is really the key issue. It still is, along with COVID, but it is that the economics of childcare are upside down. And the only way we figured out that we could make it happen in any scalable fashion was to address that very issue. And the bottom line there is the Childcare Accelerator. We brought somebody on board. I'll introduce Megan now because I want her to take this from here. We brought her on board. She had development background, economic development background, also a passion for childcare. And we think these two skill sets had to go together in forming partnerships and really figuring out how we can assess good properties, how we could identify funding to help offset costs, nurture partnerships and relationships with developing good programming that is scalable, and a model that worked overall that kept the quality high and the affordability of scalable childcare. So Megan Norris, do you want to go ahead and take it over? Is she unmuted?
She is unmuted.
Great. Why don't you go ahead and advance the slide? Go ahead, Megan.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone, and nice to be here with you today. My name is Megan Norris. I'm Central Oregon Childcare Accelerator. And I just want to I'd say a little bit, I think that Katy may have wanted to do this Childcare Accelerator slide, but essentially she talked a lot about that this is a full-time position, hired to identify the land and the advocating for new policies within our local governments and identifying funding and partners. A lot of the work that we've been doing is working with our regional partners and our steering committee, as well as providers, and making sure that we can get them all the assistance they need. Right now it's really been concentrated on COVID. I would say pre-COVID, we were really trying to help them, and still are, but on a smaller scale, through the permitting processes, working with our local governments, making sure that was all streamlined so we could get these spots created as soon as possible. And also, spearheading collaborative pilots that could ensure some of these operation models, which we'll speak a little bit about in the next slide. Also identifying and securing the employer funds, which, Katy and the steering committee did a great job of securing those funds that made my position possible. We are still collaborating with some of those employers, but acknowledging that these are tough economic and uncertain times for a lot of our employers regionally. And so while we'll, be approaching them for some of our future and more specific pilot concepts, we're really starting to pivot a little bit more to some of our funding to actually, for these pilot concepts and for my position, but also looking to collaboratively have some of those employers actually be involved in the funding of the pilot concepts. And I can speak a little bit more about that in the next slide. Also identifying funding, the land piece, that has also changed a little bit. We think that we've come up with some creative solutions that really proved to be one of the biggest uphill battles was finding the actual space here in Central Oregon. I would say on the commercial side, it's really tough, and I think this happens a lot throughout the country, but tough to get the landlords and the building owners to really buy in and to actually lease to providers. There's a lot of tenant improvement costs involved in that, and a lot of commitment from rightfully so, from the building owner to put in all those little toilets and sinks. So we think that we've also found some innovative ways to meet that challenge. and then coordinating with regional partners to ensure the quality and access to childcare. So we have a great steering committee with wonderful folks that are really involved. They live, eat, and breathe childcare and really know the latest, especially as it relates to COVID, the latest in the licensing and permitting and our regulations here. So the next slide, please. I'd like to talk a little bit about our specific pilot concept that we are in the process of putting together. And some of this was thought about and discussed pre-COVID. And so we do feel that part of this is also COVID-proof, if I could say that. The first model is a micro center model, and this model, if you can think, has a hub with a director, and it basically allows for the hub to hire childcare staff and workers and deploy them throughout different parts in the community in little micro centers of childcare. So it could be in an employer office building, it could be in a hospital. Some school districts are actually building new schools throughout the country that provides childcare for their teachers in order to increase teacher retention rates. And it also manages the enrollment piece, so making sure that these places are enrolled. You know, you can think about conference rooms. Can they actually be turned into little micro centers? Maybe library, a section of the library building. We are actually looking at doing a center, one of our first centers at one of our higher ed institutions, Central Oregon Community College. Our specific micro center concept would start in Bend, and it would include about 3 to 4 other locations. So, you know, maybe one at a higher ed, maybe one at a church, and a few others at some employer offices. And specifically one that could be with a co-working space, which I think is really interesting and innovative. But we think that that says a minimal small startup costs, and that a lot of the fees, the tuition fees, will go to managing that hub. There's a lot of collaboration with the host sites, so the host sites actually can help with reduced rent or no rent and help with the maintenance piece. It utilizes our existing partnerships in that, you know, the employers that gave to my position, we might actually be partnering with some of those. It also utilizes the Bend Chamber members and their network and actually housing some of these sites. And then also it utilizes our Central Oregon Community College Steering Committee members who would actually be placing one on the site and might even offer guidance on the curriculum for these programs, and also help staff through their early learning department and students coming out of that. And it's scalable. So, you know, the idea is to pilot it in Bend, and hopefully we can move regionally. And I think that one key way that we could do that is by linking with a higher education system and actually going to their other campuses in the region, and then partnering additional sites with employers. The second model that we're talking about is the in-home facility, which I think is a really good COVID solution right now. Just think about in-home facilities, like Rob was mentioning, haven't been impacted as much as other sectors of the childcare industry. They've mainly maintained their numbers, and they're smaller pods. So I think that there's a lot of, at least folks that I've been talking to, parents feel more comfortable with that. And also it's scalable. So our program would actually be, you know, would be regional wide first. We think that we could work with a third party, which is the third bullet, identifying a management or a partner. And for us, one that we're looking at is Wonder School. They offer the ability to market these new in-home facilities, and so it can secure enrollment, but it also offers a nice piece in terms of actually doing the tuition collection, which is a big benefit to providers, and also offers providers some online resources in terms of training and support. And then the third one is the school-aged childcare. We are yeah, we are being definitely bombarded by questions with this. And, you know, my primary role is to focus on early care, so 0 to 5. but we are getting a lot of questions about this, and we are in the process of discussing this with our steering committee, but we have been getting input and helping the city of Bend identify some properties where we could come up with innovative solutions and work with our school district to house more full-time care for our kids. And we are also looking at both of these concepts, the micro centers and the in-home. I think if our group does decide to go this way, could be easily geared to include school-aged kids. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Katy.
Go ahead and advance the last slide. So these are the things that we see coming at us in the front windshield as far as how do we deal with some of these moving pieces related to the pandemic. So first and foremost, as the previous speaker is mentioning, and the U.S. Chamber Foundation has shown a light on this, the absolute dire and immediate need for more funding for existing providers. We have lost even, like I said before, half of what was already a childcare desert. And as we pull out of this pandemic and people go back to work in the coming months, year, we are going to be reopening everything to a vastly changed landscape if we do not stand up some of these folks who are childcare providers in our community. We need more creativity and more flexibility through the state, frankly, and just through all the partners in providing ideas like the micro centers that are scalable, that you can pilot, you can test, you can refine, you can duplicate very quickly. That's why the micro centers are so exciting to us, and why we're going to just stick our neck out and try to put one in the ground or several in the ground and test this, because it's one of the only ways that could be really responsive when people go back to work. It could be geographically located, it could be business sector located, it could be aligned with school districts, public facilities, etc. There's just so much flexibility in it that we think we're going to put a lot of energy into it as a scalable comeback. And then the collaboration across sectors, which I mentioned before, is really critical. We have to break down some of the barriers that have been in existence and just look at the problem and try to solve it without sacrificing the quality and making it affordable. And then finally, to making it scalable during COVID, and frankly, as we come out of it, to be able to scale up as folks go back to work. Next slide. I think that's it. Yep. So, yep, that's the presentation. That's where we're at right now. It was a great deal of work by many, many people to get Megan's position in place and to really have an idea of what the economic challenges were and how we might go about resolving that challenge on a collaborative basis, and then how to pivot and address the issues that the pandemic has brought on us, and to be responsive to families as much as we can in a fashion that, as I mentioned before, has flexibility and scalability. Be happy to take questions if there's time.
We do have a few minutes, so thank you so much, Megan and Katy. Really appreciate it, and really appreciate you hanging in there as we dealt with some technical difficulties. One of the questions that came through was around providing CARES Act, or getting providers to apply for CARES Act funds. I was wondering if you all have done any work in that area, or if you could speak to that at all.
Yes, so I sit on the Early Learning Council for the Governor's Early Learning Division. And we got some, I believe, $38 million from the CARES Act. The state has only distributed under 20 of that $38 million, which is a challenge in and of itself. And how they solicited was in a couple of ways. They put the call out to all registered providers, and then they went to the hubs, the regional hubs, to, I guess, curate the ones that they know that were in trouble, that were highly utilized, that we knew needed the money and directed them to the application process. The need was far, 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 far bigger than the pot of money was. And this was a statewide coordinated effort through the regional hubs. So that's how we went about disseminating at least a portion of the CARES Act. We're hoping the governor will release the rest of the money.
Great. And then we also have a question here just about how you're planning to make the program that you're running sustainable and Megan's position sustainable moving forward, how you're planning to fund that in the future, and how you have gotten, or have you gotten businesses committed beyond this year? What does that model look like for you?
Well, I'll start on this and Megan weigh in on it if you have anything to add. So most, I'd say, if I remember correctly, 60 or 70% of the money was from private sector, from business. And this is how dire the problem was just before all the COVID started. So the model for sustainability was that Megan's position would be funded through these blended stacked funding protocols we were putting together with private sector investment and other participants, foundational participants. We had a 3-year runway for her job to become self-sufficient. And then it would, one of the ideas that we had is once we had the first 3 years done and targeting those 1,000 slots and involving the business community and funding her job for those first 3 years, it would be something that might turn into a site or facility coordinator that would be working with the macro hubs and with the private sector kind of as a liaison on a paid basis. So that was the model we were looking at over the long term, is providing a service that private sector paid for. But until then, we needed 3 years of funding that was blended. And we've been making a little bit of progress on that, but frankly, the last 4 months have just been a crazy ride. And I'm not sure about funding. We're still working on that from local foundations, state foundations, federal, national, and also private sector donations. Megan, is there something I forgot?
No, I think that sounds good. And, we're working with some folks to help us just, write grants and continue expanding those efforts. I think that there's some opportunity. I think that Katy did a great job in reaching out to, her chamber members. And I think there might be some opportunity. I'm hopeful and throughout the region and other locations. But I do think that it's heavily going to, as a result of COVID, come from a lot of those foundational supports.
And I think we have time for one more question, so I'll ask this question. Are you doing anything around getting unlicensed in-home providers to register their facilities or to become licensed? And how did that factor into your supply and demand analysis that you did?
So that is a definite factor that's out there, and we're all quite aware of it. We had to focus our energy. One of the things, and if you get private money to help resolve this issue, you really have to focus on creating the slots. And that's where we put our energy. Although we know there are a lot of folks out there unregistered, and that's exponentially growing. With the schools not being able to open up here in Bend and in Central Oregon, at least until the first 6 weeks. So we're looking at late October, maybe November, before they'll even consider opening them. Right now, we're 100% online. And so people will get creative. You are gonna, I'm sure this is nationwide. We'll see neighborhoods, friends, family units, and other types of constructs form out there that are entirely informal and untrackable. And so we didn't concentrate our efforts in that area. We were more concerned with what models can we put out there that are fundable, that we can blend private and public, and just basically the bottom line is just create more slots, registered quality childcare slots available.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for answering those questions. And we are at the end of our time today. And so I'd like to just once again thank Katie and Megan and Rob for their presentations today. As I said at the beginning, we will be sending out the recording of this and the slides and handouts as well. So look for those. Thank you for your time today. And please let us know if there's anything that we can do to support your work moving forward.